So Duane, like, are you okay if we just kind of have a free flowing conversation?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. And obviously, I want to get into the theory that you are so passionate about, but I'm also kind of hoping, if you can, to just tell me more about yourself and almost like the man behind the theory.
Mm, what can I say?
Like, how did you get into what you write about, what you're so passionate about?
That's a good question. And every time I tell the story, I tell a different one. Uh,
Okay.
I obviously haven't settled on an answer yet, but I think it really began, believe it or not, it began with activism, anarchism, and a particular militant form of activism,
Mm,
um, where I was very much involved in um, organizing social movements. I was participating in riots and these sorts of things. Um, and I realized at some point that I needed to find a way to make anarchism last beyond the age of 24, 25, which is when it tends to die for people. Uh,
yeah.
Here I'm quoting a friend, a late friend, because he passed away
Mm,
a few years ago, named Aragorn out of California, who always used to ask the question, can anarchism survive beyond the age of 24, 25, something like that? And I discovered that, believe it or not, the university was quite hospitable to anarchist thought.
mm,
And so I wrote that for a little while. And during my master's degree, I discovered a particular, let's call it a flavor of anarchism, that was presented to me by a Canadian sociologist who I deeply respect named Richard J. F. Day. He wrote this book titled Gramsci is Dead. And it had this Lacanian infused theoretical conceptual system that I found to be uh, quite critical, quite reflexive, and it kind of meshed with some of the what's known as post-left or nihilistic currents that I was uh, gravitating toward at the time, but it had a really sophisticated logical structure that I found compelling. And so I started to think about Lacanian anarchism. And by the time I got to my PhD, I had uh, some personal problems, such as an eating disorder and panic disorder, the panic disorder being quite severe.
mm,
And I had gone through a number of different treatment methodologies, none of which seemed to help, some of which seemed to exacerbate the problem, such as
sure.
CBT. And I said, okay, well, maybe I should use my intellectual curiosity as a gateway into a clinical experience, which is precisely what I did. And I saw the effects in my own life. And I saw that Lacanian psychoanalysis and the Freudian field were intensely intellectual and forever surprising. And I found in it something much more revolutionary and anarchistic than anarchism itself.
Wow.
And so I've been kind of pursuing that journey now since that time for more than 10 years.
Yeah. Can you speak to, and this is kind of a podcast therapy for guys. I don't just talk about men's issues or masculinity. That's a small aspect. It's actually kind of evolved out of that a little bit. I've even thought about changing the name of the podcast because I want a broader audience. But I am curious, since we're sitting here, I'm assuming you identify as male. I'm curious if you could speak about what it was like to start the psychoanalytic process, as an analysand. Like, did you have any fears? What was it like in the beginning? Yeah,
Mm.
maybe you
Mm.
could go there.
Yeah, that's a really great and precise question. I don't know what I could say, but if I could sort of um, try to examine it using the cues that you've provided, I would say that I think for some it could be presented as an emasculating experience.
Mm,
For some, uh, psychoanalysis is, as Freud said, a cure through love, and love is is a resolutely feminine experience, at least according to Jacques-Alain Miller. It feminizes, because to love you have to expose your lack in a certain non-exhibitionist sense, and these sorts of things. But I would say it has been my experience. A fundamental turning point in my analysis had, perhaps, now that I'm thinking about it, something to do with masculinity. And it was not so long ago. I was in Russia at the time. I had a very striking nightmare, the
Mm.
last nightmare I've ever had, in fact.
Wow.
Um, and this nightmare, I won't go through the entire nightmare with you, but it was pivotal for my next phase of my analysis. And in it, I was searching for the woman in my dream who had gone missing, who I couldn't find. And then I was surrounded by a multiplicity of women who I didn't recognize, speaking a foreign language. And then in the third scene of the dream, I looked down at my ID, and the ID showed a woman's picture on it, and it was written in foreign font. And I was shocked. Identity crisis.
Yeah.
And then the fourth scene, I'm looking in the mirror and I see myself. My gesticulations are being mimicked in the mirror. I am a woman. And I woke
Mm.
up in horror.
Mm.
Uh, Very horrific experience. And So I would say the psychoanalytic experience certainly leads you to question, interrogate, and to think further about identity, masculine, feminine, it doesn't matter, whatever identity is. Um, so um, I think that's all I can say on that point. I don't know if I identify as a man or what.
Sure, sure.
Nietzsche said, "I'm not a man, I am dynamite." That was Nietzsche's answer. I'm not a man, I'm dynamite. But I wouldn't say that I identify as anything else, but I certainly play the role very well.
Mm. And that's one thing that has really resonated with me in listening to a lot of your talks and interviews. And you've spoken recently about, not even identifying as a professor, that it's just this, I know this is my language, it's a fiction, or it's a role that's being played, and you even talk about you're not even sure if you believe the shit that comes out of your mouth, and that to me is so refreshing. It's something that draws me to you. It's a type of, I don't know if I should call it a humility or just an honesty, but in a world where everyone's so sure about everything and so tied to these identities, it's so refreshing to have someone of your caliber just kind of hold things so lightly.
Yeah, but it's light enough to present oneself as a man. It's
Mm.
light enough. One of the biggest problems is to occupy the position of what Lacan called, now we get a little technical, the non-dupes.
Mm.
Because the non-dupes are also those who see the world of fiction and place themselves on the side of satisfaction, which is opposed to the fictions of the world. Oh, it's all fictions, but they're all the more duped because, in some sense, you can only enter the world through fiction.
Yeah.
There's no other way. So you have to pass through the fiction. You can't just be like Diogenes and be master of your satisfactions and these sorts of things and be some cynic off to the side who just like a total nihilist who doesn't believe in anything and these sorts of things. You can see that the world is a fiction, but you also have to experiment in that world. If you're going to be a part of the world, you have to enter the world of fiction, and that can be really hard for a cynic,
Mm.
for a non-dupe, for a person at the end of their analysis, and for many at the beginning. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't mind changing my mind. I said one thing about artificial intelligence a month ago, and I'm saying something quite different as of yesterday. I don't care. Lacan once said, I think it was in La Troisième, the third, he said he can make any word mean any other word. It doesn't
Mm.
matter. He's like Eminem. He can make orange rhyme with banana, orangeana. Why
Oh,
not?
that's brilliant. I love it, man. Now, okay, wanting maybe to bring two strands together that you've just talked about. going back to that nightmare with all the feminine figures, and then you talked about in light of Freud analysis being about a type of love. From the little that I know about your biography, I know that you've had several relationships, and I think you've even written a book about love. I'm wondering where your psyche, if I can call it that, where your psyche will go with that question, kind of the relationship to the woman, love in your life. Has that been a roller coaster? How would you kind of frame that?
Yeah,
And
I
I know I'm
wrote this.
asking some intimate questions.
I don't mind. I really
Oh,
don't mind.
well,
No,
thank
no,
you.
I appreciate it. You're a great analyst. When I wrote the book Real Love with Atropos Press, I wrote it in about a month, in haste,
Wow.
very quickly. And the reason I wrote it, I just came out of a really, really painful
Mm,
divorce. It was an interfaith marriage. I
okay.
believed that I loved her to the absolute bitter end. And it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination. And so, it was a really difficult time. And I had this hypothesis that love perhaps um, is thought of in different, let's say, discursive ways according to particular religious scriptures. And so I thought, okay, Christian religious scripture. I mean, I'm simplifying to the extreme, but
Sure.
Christian religious scripture will say, for example, particularly certain branches of Christianity, love thy neighbor as thyself. There's a very secular attitude. You see it in render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and this
Right.
stuff where you can have a universal community where you have different members within it, so long as you embrace a notion of liberal tolerance. And I thought that this is a form of love, and you see it in relationships with people, and so on, and then something different in Islam, and so on. And I was just kind of exploring that, but what did it say about me, which is the question you're asking, and that brings something new to it. I completely reject this book. It's a terrible book, Real
Mm,
Love. Real love, the real, there's also a modality of love that is, I don't know, in popular psychology they'll call it trauma bonding.
oh, sure.
Like a cycle of traumatic love encounters. That could be real love.
Mm,
So you can move from, oh, I just had a traumatic breakup or encounter with a particular woman, and then a period of relative tranquility, mourning or whatever, and then you have it again, and then you have it again, which to some extent I think is true in my life. I've had that. And so it's love. I don't know if you can call it love in a psychoanalytic sense, because it's reduced to a certain repetition that would be inherent to what analysts would call instinct or drive, something like that. And this repetitious encounter with trauma, that's a type of love. And I think
mm,
increasingly, particularly in America where you are, a lot of people are experiencing this type of love.
yes.
They're fleeting encounters. You repeat, why is every guy I'm with cheating on me? It's the same story each time you go through.
Right.
Um, and so I think, that book, I learned that real love is something entirely different than anything I wrote about in that book.
Wow.
I had no understanding yet of the notion of drive, of fixation, of repetition, um, of a domain of what Lacan called jouissance that is dissociated from any knowledge or desire.
Mm,
When people think love, they often conflate it with desire, but really you have things like you have love, you have drive, and you have desire. And in a technical Lacanian sense, you can say love is what mediates between drive satisfactions and desire in
mm,
some technical sense. But the way I'm using love, sometimes I lapse too much into sociology and I lose the technical precision. So I regret the book. I don't think I said anything I wanted to say in it,
mm.
except for the title, which says it all.
Wow. Is there, and again, I'm not technically a Lacanian, but I'm interested in some of his ideas. So if I ask a question that comes across really stupid, I apologize. But is there a sense in which the real love connects with his register that he called the real, which I don't fully understand or know how to articulate, but is there a sense in which love is about the real?
Yeah, I think so. I think
Okay.
that's what I was aiming at. And the real
Okay.
is, of course, the register of I mean, there's different modalities of the real throughout Lacan's teaching, of course. I
Sure.
mean, it's one of the big debates that I have right now with the Slovenian school, who I don't know how many people will be familiar with the Slovenian school, but particularly Slavoj Žižek. One of our major debates has to do with which paradigm is our point of departure in thinking about the real.
Mm,
What paradigm of jouissance are we beginning with? And depending upon where we begin with our understanding or conceptualization of the real, it will lead to making certain assumptions about other people, like how we diagnose them or how we diagnose particular cultures or particular ideological configurations. And I think Zizek has certain assumptions about what the real is, which is almost always reduced to what he calls surplus jouissance.
mm,
And I'm working from a later period in Lacan's teaching, one that's taken up. We're given a compass by Jacques-Alain Miller, and it's a particular modality of the real that it almost seems as though it's a more primordial version of the real, rather than this sort of real that is inherent to some sort of symbolic apparatus. I realize I'm getting really technical. I don't know how technical I should get. Maybe I'll
no,
pull a
this is
little bit.
great. No, this is great. Would Alenka Zupančič be a part of the Slovenian school?
Yes, and not just a part, but the heart of it.
Okay.
Yeah, Alenka's work
I've
is
only read What is Sex, which was incredible.
incredible book. And I mean, my reading of Alenka's work, Alenka, I really like, a really gracious person and an incredible thinker.
Mm,
Um, what I like about Alenka lately is that I can't say why, but I sense the way in which her work is moving toward the sort of orientation that I'm working on, while still somehow maintaining a commitment to the fundamental coordinates of the Slovenian school, of which um, not much has actually changed over the years, because of course Zizek tends to repeat
sure.
his teaching, but a lot of the gems that you find in Zizek's work, you can almost trace them back to Alenka.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's fascinating. Now, I know one of the questions I had for you too was in terms of your background in sociology, how do you think that informs who you are and then your academic work? I think that's an interesting lens to connect with like psychoanalysis. That was one of the things that drew me to you was, your background in sociology.
Yeah. Do you have a background in sociology?
I don't. I
No.
have
No.
I have a background in theology and religious studies.
Yes, I knew this. I knew this. Yeah, yeah. Theology. Yeah. Sociology is interesting because I my first degree was computer programming, basically. And I
Wow.
had like computer code tattooed on my body and stuff. I was a real computer, and I had a job with EA Sports, making paper.
Really?
A very brief period, but you
Oh
know,
my gosh.
this was the beginning of real love, really, because I was in deep love with the. Well,
Mm,
I was very young, and I didn't want to keep this job. I wanted to stay with her, and so I found a way. I decided I'm going to go to university. She's going to university. I'll go to university, and I tried to get into a computer science program, another
got
computer
you.
program. And I was admitted, but then there were some social issues happening in Canada at the time, which led to double or triple the amount of students coming into the universities.
Sure.
They collapsed grade 13, basically.
Mm,
And so they revoked my admission. So I went on a hunger strike, which is easy, by the way, for an anorexic like myself.
got you.
use my symptom. And so I was on a hunger strike, and finally I was causing so much trouble for them. They said, "Okay, we're going to let you in the university, but you seem like an activist, so we want you to go into the arts, and you should major in sociology." I said,
Mm,
"Fabulous! That's what I'm going to do." So that's how I got into sociology. but I've made it work because I think, um, although psychoanalysts, not all, but many of those that I sort of associate with, are very critical of sociology,
Mm,
as they should be. It is a product of the university. It does tend to focus on, let's say, a social theory that would be for all, or hyper pragmatic social theories and these sorts of things. It doesn't really have a strong psychoanalytic orientation. So people are suspicious of it. But what sociology can show us is the importance of the social bond. And there is
mm,
a convergence here with psychoanalysis, particularly since Lacan in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Lacan made it very clear that the social bond can be a measure of sanity. You know,
mm.
if you're talking about, let's say, psychosis, you can have what some would call a threefold externality, of which I'll just list one. You
Sure.
feel external to the social bond.
Mm,
And so, in some sense, the social bond, being included in a social configuration of one sort or another, can stabilize you. And it seems kind of obvious, but it's important. When Lacan said we have four discourses, all of which depend upon the master's discourse, he also said discourse is a social bond. The
mm,
social bond has the structure of discourse. And there's only one clinical configuration that can be said to exist outside of discourse, and that's psychosis.
mm.
So it's clear that something to do with psychosis will need some sociology there.
Yeah.
And so there's something here at the nexus of sociology and psychoanalysis that I think is quite fundamental, but we have to do it in a I think in a particularly psychoanalytic way, which is why Jacques-Alain Miller, he said it in the following way. He said Jacques Lacan's sociology. Those are his words.
Mm,
Jacques-Alain Miller referred to Lacan's work as a particular type of sociology. But he added, and then I'll shut up. He added right before he said that, he said, "But I take words with a pinch of salt."
mm. I like that.
Yeah.
Man, Duane, please don't feel like you need to shut up because I could listen to you for hours. So please go on as long as you need to.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so social bond, one of the questions I wrestle with is, again, maybe going back to men for a second. I know this is more maybe the United States. I don't know where you're at, but friendships, a lot of males don't have friendships. We struggle with kind of being part of communities. I don't know if you have any reflections on that. In terms of your scholarship, your own life, how would you navigate some of those kind of thorny issues around like men and the social bond?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I mean, I'd have to think about it a lot more. I know that we are certainly living in a lonely time.
Yes.
I know that what we used to call the non-rapport, uh, which was a sense in which um, there was we never really had a connection with other people, but we believed we did, and we believed we could have one. Today, it seems to me, I risk it, maybe I'm wrong,
Mm,
that people are abundantly aware that there's no such thing as a rapport, a relationship with others. And what we suffer from is being delusional enough to enter the fiction of being in a relationship with others. As for myself, I find myself, if I can just be really brutally honest,
please.
I'm terrified to be in relationships today.
I am
I'm just,
too.
I'm just terrified. Um, I think more and more.
Can you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you say why? Kind of,
Yeah, yeah, I will,
okay.
I will.
Thank you.
I, but I don't think I'm alone here.
No.
I think more and more people feel the social bond of any kind to be threatening.
Mm,
Like the social bond feels to us to be traumatizing. It feels to us to be anxiety provoking. And so we'd rather be alone, but we can't live with being alone. But we're also afraid of what it means to pay the price of admission into a social bond, whether that be a relationship with a woman or whatever else. Um, it's quite different than how it used to be, because how it used to be would be we would be in a relationship and we would complain, that it's, this relationship is putting me in a prison. I want to, like in the 1980s, for example, 1970s, a lot of patients would come, they talk to their psychoanalyst, and they'd say, I love my wife, but I have a desire, sexual desire for somebody outside.
Right.
But they were quite happy in their relationship. The problem was going outside. You see, the problem was within the confines of a social order. They found a
Yes.
problem. But today, it's increasing exponentially. We have a problem with entering the social bond as such. We are outside of it. This is why a lot of my work begins with an assumption of what Miller called, and I say it playfully, I don't quite mean it like this, but a generalized foreclosure, which means that
Mm.
there's a sense in which we don't have problems within a social order anymore. Like, we're all repressed and exploited within a totality that we can call capitalism or patriarchy. I think the problem is, I keep saying, it's worse. That's what Lacan would have said in one of his seminars. It's worse in that precisely by stepping out of that, we feel the tyranny of men, of patriarchy, the castrating tendencies of women, of the brutal effects of capitalism in a much more severe form,
Mm.
precisely because we're outside of it. That's what it means to shift from the symbolic to the real.
Mm.
What is foreclosed in the symbolic reappears in the real. Before we accepted the price of admission into capitalism, it sucked. I'll give you an example with capitalism. Like, we would
Please.
have to go and work some shitty job, and they would extract a bunch of money from us, and we couldn't even make, like, say I'm working at McDonald's, I couldn't even make in 1 hour the amount of money to buy one of those 200 Big Macs that I built in that.
Right. Right.
And I knew I was screwed, but because of that, we could have revolutionary consciousness, we can form a union, we could strive toward communism.
Right.
But today, we won't even go to the factory. Like, we're all like, go look at TikTok. Everybody's talking about how they're dropping out from the social order. Like, I don't want to be a wage slave. I don't, like, they are so anti-capitalist that they're
Mm.
futile. They're futile. And you need capitalism in order to move ahead. And it's the same with our social relationships. Like, in order to complain about a relationship, you have to first pay the price of admitting yourself into it.
Mm.
It's what nobody wants to pay the price for anymore. Like, you have to humiliate yourself, let's say, as a man, to the risk of being hurt, so that you can be in a relationship, so that you can have something to complain about again and not be traumatized about.
Dude, that is so fucking great. I couldn't agree more. Do you, and I know this is like way too complicated to give one answer to, but I would love for you just to kind of riff on this question. How did we get to the state that you're describing where we're not even, connected or in a social bond, where we're kind of on the outside? Like, how did that happen?
I think it was inevitable.
Mm.
Uh, the social order was held together. And by social order, I mean across all scales, whether it's a country, a global order, or a family, or a marriage, whatever.
Sure.
It was held together by what Lacan called the nom de père. Um, Basically, some sort of um, signifier that we believed that wowed us enough. That's what Lacan called it. He said it wowed us. The
Mm.
father wowed us. We were impressed by the father, his gadgets, his slick ways. He seemed smart and these sorts of things. And because we were so enamored by the father, let's say as children, we would accept his no to our satisfactions. We would have to give up our satisfactions. Let's say you're playing video games. You can play all day long. The father would come in and say, no, you can't play video games. You would respect that, and it would suck. You would stop playing video games. And then you'd blame the father. You'd want to go back and play video games again. You have a desire to play video games. He gave you desire.
Mm.
You didn't have that before he came. let's say he didn't come and you didn't accept the wow of the father, you would be playing video games, endlessly enjoying yourself, pissing your pants, defecating in your pants, and you'd be getting diseases and so on. Because if there's one thing about satisfaction is we often don't know how to relinquish it. We need an alibi. We need somebody to blame for taking it away from us.
Mm.
And so for a long time, the father served that function. President, we would blame police, judges, whatever. It
Sure.
served that function. But it always served that function at the price of us being dissatisfied enough to rise up and revolt, as hysterics did, as activists did, as I did. We would rise up. And the more we rise up, the more we realize that the function of the nom de père cannot hold. It's flooding. It starts flooding. And once it starts floating, it erodes. Zizek calls this the decline of symbolic efficiency or paternal authority. Lacan diagnosed it in his teachings in the late 1960s. But you name it, any social theory you name that's a big social theory, they've diagnosed it.
Mm.
The Society of the Spectacle, liquid modernity, risk capitalism, postmodern capitalism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism. All of these things are simply theories of the erosion of the father's authority.
Mm.
And the question is not simply why did it happen, which was inevitable. The father's an idiot. The father, he's an idiot. He has to be an idiot to rule. He just says no, and we have to dream up the reasons as to why he said that, which is what slaves and students do. We say, oh, the professor must have meant that, and we do all the work. But I totally lost my thread. But what happened was after the function, the father fell, you
Sure.
get two tendencies which are really problematic, and this is where things get really difficult. You get forms of nostalgia.
Mm.
I'm really suspicious of nostalgia. Nostalgia is perverse, first off. It's a perverse affect. The nostalgia is for a father that you believed ever held the social order together in the first place. So what you resurrect hierarchies. You talk about, like Jordan Peterson, hierarchies are in nature.
Right.
I understand where he's coming from. I respect the guy, actually. And you get people wanting to rebuild, make America great again, make the family great again. You have the rise of movements that would try to stabilize society by resurrecting a lost ideal of the father.
Mm.
It won't work. It'll only reproduce the problem in a purer form. And then you have the nostalgia of the so-called left. They want to rebuild the left. I keep reading this in Jacobin magazine and other rebuild. They think they lost the great social movements of the 1960s on. We have to This is also nostalgia, and you know where it leads?
Mm.
Not toward the reinvigoration of the father's potency, in other words, authoritarian, tyrannical rule. It leads toward what Lacan called segregation.
Mm.
From para to peers, you move from the father to the peers to the comrades. And this is the situation the left is in. The left is nostalgic, and so they try and rebuild social movements where they're insular, they fight with anything outside of their bubble, they segregate from the world, from other social groups.
They're
And
fucking
the right,
vicious.
they are really vicious. And nobody's immune. Nobody's immune from it. And how do you work with that? All we can say is that neither the father nor the peers, like
Mm.
both of these approaches have their basis, I believe, in some form of nostalgia. They recognize, if only unconsciously, that something of the former social order has eroded. They want it back. They want some stability. They want to enter the social order, but in every effort to do so, they're reproducing their segregation from it.
Mm.
So I don't know where to go from there, but it's not a hopeful time.
Well, now I think so. Where I would like to go, just to kind of build a step, forward, is to ask, yeah, is there any hope, or is there an alternative in your mind, or are we just kind of fucked? And if we are, I can try to integrate that, but
I don't know if we're fucked, but I think
okay.
It's difficult because what is an alternative? This is a source of another debate I've had with Slavoj Žižek over the
Okay.
years. He even conceded my point several times
Wow.
in his way. The idea that we are in some sort of capitalism, let's say, just to give us some sort of concrete example of the problem,
Sure.
and capitalism is the problem, as some people maintain, um, then the idea is we need to experiment with possibilities outside of capitalism. You'll
Mm,
hear anarchists say another world is possible,
sure.
which really scares the hell out of me because that could be a nostalgic statement as well.
Mm,
You'll hear people say we need to build autonomous movements that could demonstrate here and now or prefigure the future that we want to see, and these sorts of things. But all of these approaches, and even Zizek's approach, is a good friend of mine. I critique him totally as a friend. In fact, I critique him to advance this project further.
mm,
Uh, all of these approaches presume that capitalism isn't already positioned as the alternative, which is a fundamental point. Capitalism today is the alternative. And when you're dealing with a system that presents itself as the alternative, which means not as a universal total system, then the alternative to the alternative could be a return to the old form of capitalism, um, or what? I don't know. Um, the problem with this alternative idea is that when you think of capitalism, it always says, well, what do you want? You want tyranny. We are the alternative to Soviet Russia.
mm,
We are the alternative to Chinese capitalism. Western capitalism knows that it can have power in saying that it is already the only option as an alternative. So I don't think we need alternatives. I think what we need right now is serious thinking about the shit that we're in. We
mm.
need theory more than ever. I know I'm echoing Zizek here, but I agree with him. We need theory. Seriously, we need theory. Precisely at a time when theory is an enemy to the Western world.
Mm.
Because most of this stuff that we're in right now came out of, it's my hypothesis, it came out of the Midwest of the United States, where pragmatic philosophy, psychology, and sociology was being brewed. And if you look at the thought that was going on there, William James, John Dewey, not C. Wright Mills, Charles Horton Cooley, George Herbert Mead, these folks, um, basically they had an approach to truth that depended upon its consequences, what they called the
Mm.
cash value notion of truth,
Sure.
which means that whatever works. And so a lot of them believed in practical stuff, and it led one Marxist in the United States named C. Wright Mills to rise up against theory as such. He basically conflated all theory with grand theory,
Mm.
and he wanted some practical, pragmatic form of Marxism. But this is what the alternative is. It's based upon this logic of hyper pragmatism, whatever works, fleeting interactions. The truth is never endures from point A to point D in sequence.
Sure.
These sorts of things. So I think right now we desperately need theory, and we need people who are willing to think at a level of abstraction that will not necessarily trigger people or offend them, but that the concepts will do their magic of their own, while still listening to what's happening in the world and witnessing it.
Well, thank you for the work that you do in terms of theory. We need people like you.
Thank you.
I want to ask you this question, and I think maybe it connects to what you've been talking about. At one level, I want to ask you, how do you understand the unconscious? But the question I want to ask you is today, where is the unconscious? As I've been listening to you speak in previous conversations, I feel like that's a question you're trying to explore. So I was hoping maybe on this podcast, you could just maybe riff on where you feel like the unconscious is today and kind of take that wherever you want.
Yeah, sure. The question is, where is the unconscious? Um, First off, one of the mistakes I think a lot of people make when they first start thinking about psychoanalysis from a theoretical position, and even from a clinical position, is to think of the unconscious as uh, a, a relatively flat surface that doesn't have a number of agencies operating within it. If
Mm,
you look at Freud's, let's say, his second topography, what you see in it is that there, there's a dynamic approach among the various agencies, which means that the unconscious can be knotted in different ways. Um, and I think, some people have a tendency of defining the unconscious as some sort of reservoir of knowledge which is repressed. So it's an unconscious that can be interpreted at the level of meaning, a semantic unconscious, something like this.
sure.
And the idea is that through some sort of work of interpretation, which could be cultural criticism for a lot of people, I mean, their whole identities depend upon believing that this is what the unconscious is. Otherwise, they can't do cultural commentary. Um, is to tap into what they would call like a latent meaning
Mm,
that's been fabricated somehow through condensation or displacement, secondary revision, or whatever. In what people say about their dreams, you're finding hidden meaning inside of it and bringing it
sure.
home. But Freud was clear that this isn't the unconscious. He calls that a mistake if you're interpreting it there. This is what some people call the unknown knowns.
Mm,
Conscious is a domain of unknown knowledge. You don't even know what you know. There's some tacit knowledge that compels you to act in certain ways, and so on. But Freud also talked about a primitive unconscious and the navel of the dream and this dark,
mm,
he didn't use the word real unconscious somewhere. I can't remember where. And so there's also the unconscious of the id, the unconscious of the drives and these sorts of things, which has more to do with our satisfactions, our jouissance, and much less to do with meaning. There's another movement in Freud's work that I find interesting. Like, just I'm going to take it really simple. He moved from dream interpretation to symptoms.
mm,
What's the difference? If you're dealing with dreams in a simplistic sense, what's it mean? There's a dwelling space, which is, let's say, confined to the sleeping state, within which we suppose dreams to occur. With symptoms, something can go beyond repression and it can come out into the world. We can daydream, we can write creative works of art, we can paint, and something of our dreams can enter the world. Something of our unconscious can enter the world. It's pretty clear that Freud was saying that a symptom is is a satisfaction that's allowed to pass beyond repression as a compromise formation because the repression doesn't know what to do with it. So this is how it can allow it to pass. It comes through as a symptom. And I think there's something in symptoms in these movements that go beyond repression that can tell us about the unconscious today. When a person is writing a creative work of fiction, they're using metaphor, they're using metonymy, they're using secondary revision, all these creative tools that are the tools of the dream work, also the tools of poetry. Something of the dream is entering reality. It's using the tools of the dream, the psyche, if you just want to keep it simple. And so it's clear that today repression isn't operative because for repression to be operative, maybe it's operative, but I'm being a bit dramatic.
sure.
But for repression to be operative, basic repression, there's different types of repression. You can have repression of repression and so on. But you basically have to suppose that there's a no of the father that has forced you to renounce your satisfactions in waking life, so you get them in your dreams and so on. When that function isn't working anymore, and it's clear it's not in our society, I don't think that's debatable. Then something goes beyond repression. Our satisfactions are there in waking life, right? And so, what's the purpose of dreaming? No wonder nobody dreams today. Almost
Mm,
nobody dreams. Very few people dream today. Maybe a dream here and there, a lot of nightmares.
mm,
But we don't dream like we used to dream. So my idea is, and I say it only to be dramatic, the
Sure.
unconscious is outside of ourselves. And I think the reason this causes so many problems for people when I say it, everybody seems to disagree with me, um, is because they imagine that the unconscious is in the brain, which is like that's a biological conception. I mean, if the unconscious comes from anywhere, where does it come from? And how does it get inside? And so it's a question of when there's no repression, the barrier that would have separated the outside from the inside is no longer there. So I would say if we want to find the unconscious today, we're not going to find it necessarily through dream analysis
Mm,
or anything like that. We're going to find it in the forms of satisfaction that are existing outside of us in our waking lives, in the groups that we form, in artificial intelligence, in all of the various things that we witness in culture.
sure. Oh, I like that. Okay, so Duane, can you speak to this? You've kind of connected these two ideas in other talks. I was hoping you could just talk about it here. You explored kind of entering the Islamic faith for at least a period of your life, and then you have this image of the cave that's important to you, or at least was at one point, and then
Mm.
you've connected that to this Black Mirror episode,
Mm.
Nosedive, I think it's called, which was one of my favorites. I love that series on Netflix. I think it's great on so many levels. Could you kind of do your thing around some of those ideas? Because I think it's so great, and I would love my audience to kind of access that.
Oh, thank you. I think it connects to what I was just saying.
I do too.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it's from Plato into the biblical conceptions of caves and the function of caves in the Bible. I met a scholar who's doing wonderful work on studying caves in Scripture,
Oh
in
wow.
the sort of topological relationship that Scripture has to caves. It's fabulous, and I think there's something really important here because you look at the function of caves in each of the Abrahamic religions, and then look at the function of caves in like Hinduism and Buddhism. It's just fascinating. I mean, if I
Mm,
had time, I'd talk for half an hour just about that. It's incredible because
wow. Well, maybe I can
it
have you back on, and you can talk about caves.
yeah, but basically the idea is that I'll keep it really simple. In the narrative, I know you already know it since you asked the question, but in the narrative of the seven sleepers of the cave in Islam, there's a bit of a twist because in my reading, and it's been a long time since I read it, so I might be getting a few things wrong. There's You're basically situated in the radical space of alterity,
Mm,
and you're free, which is, I think freedom is the worst thing in the world. There's nothing worse than freedom. I'm not saying confinement is any better, but maybe some confinement of your own choosing, which is precisely what these seven sleepers found.
right.
They were free to worship any god, I think maybe to be atheist, basically a pagan world. And that was just horrific for them, as I imagine it would be for anybody. And they decided to go to a cave, fall asleep for like 100 something years. I think a dog was guarding the entrance, and they would dream, but they were also free to worship any god they liked. They found a way to enter the fiction,
Mm,
space of non-dupery, and I find that absolutely incredible. They found their cave, and I think that's the position we're in. We're not in this necessarily Platonic or Abrahamic conception of the cave right now.
sure.
We're where you're already in the cave of ideology or whatever it is, and there's certain things that you don't know about, and you need to come out to get enlightenment, to then refer to other like tell other people. And I don't think we're there anymore. I think we're radically outside, and our trick is to find four walls. One of the ways to think about it is to think about the notion of the uncanny in Freud.
Mm,
I think there's something a little short-sighted in the notion of the uncanny. The uncanny, unheimlich, means unhomely. And the whole idea, at least the popular conception of it, is you are in a dwelling space, your man cave, if you like. You're in your man cave, which, by the way, a man cave only existed within a home with where you were in a heterosexual relationship with your wife, and it was your space to retreat, to meditate, read scripture, or just
Right.
play video games or whatever else you're doing, eat Cheetos in your underwear, and then you come out, and it's like it's your version of a sacred space.
Mm,
But today, the man cave doesn't exist in the home because there is no home. Like,
mm,
we've gone from the unheimlich to radical homelessness, which is
mm,
fundamentally different. For Freud, there's a foreign intruder within our living space, whatever, some monster within. That's the uncanny. But in a situation of that Lacan diagnosed, I think, it's it's literally. I mean, they even use the word foreclosure when we're talking about a housing crisis. We're in a housing crisis. You can't even have a foreign intruder.
mm.
You can't even get to that space. We need to get to the space of knowing how to put up four walls again and have literally a living space, a space where we can protect ourselves from the environment at a very simplistic level.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, for the individuals that you work with in your clinic, and as you interact with people, maybe as a professor and just in other relationships, why are we so drawn to this freedom that you think is actually kind of a terrible thing? What's the allure? And maybe
I
there's
don't
not one
know.
answer, but
I don't know. I think I remember, was it Martin Luther King Jr.? I can't remember who it was gave this allegory of a of hunters who got a big piece of meat and put a blade inside of it.
hmm,
And the wolves would come and they'd lick the meat and they'd keep licking it and they think they're having a really good time. They're cutting their tongue, they're killing themselves. And in some sense, we're all just children, or we're all animals in this particular way. Like, um, if you give a child endless candy before they've learned how to, before they've been inaugurated into the pleasure reality principles, as Freud
hmm,
called them, before they've sort of been brought into a social order, they may endlessly eat that junk food and get very, very, very sick because satisfaction wants to keep being satisfied. We don't want to relinquish our satisfaction. That's why many of us need an alibi. We
hmm,
need to blame it on somebody else. And it's why Slavoj, for example, will always say that he prefers the tyrannical ruler to the postmodern ruler. The postmodern ruler will give you your satisfactions, will say, what do you want to do? I think
sure.
that's radical. It's a series because you can't blame that person for anything. But a good ruler will take away some of your freedom, allow you to blame that person,
Mm,
which is crucial. You need to blame them. They need to be hated. You offload them. I'll give you an example.
yeah,
Since I
this is
mentioned
good.
Slavoj Žižek. I did two PhDs. I did one in at Trent University. I did another under Slavoj Žižek in Switzerland. The first one, I had to do a demonstration of expertise where I had to read several hundred books or something, and then I was tested. Okay, I had a professor who gave me a question, and I remember very clearly, I thought the question he gave me on this exam was, to be frank, bullshit. I felt like he never read the books.
Got you.
But the great function it served was that I remember thinking, if I get that question wrong, I can blame that guy.
Mm,
He asked me a terrible question. I might fail, but I still have my dignity and I can prove it. Okay, I ended up doing well, but I remember going through that process. In Switzerland, Slavoj Žižek said, ask yourself a question and then answer it.
mm,
Oh, it's genius. It's tyrannical. It's postmodern. And he was being cruel because, I'm obviously not going to say, what's your favorite chocolate bar?
right.
Like, I'm going to try. So, not, I have to answer the question. I'm allowed my own satisfactions, my own enjoyment, my own framing. Nobody's prohibiting anything here. But if I do terribly, I have to blame myself.
Mm,
And this is the source of significant problems in the last 40, 50 years. We all feel guilt, depression, because we bear the personal responsibility for almost everything.
Mm.
I want to live in a society where I'm not responsible for everything, where I can hate somebody, he'll allow us to hate them, you know? So I think that'll be a lot, that would be progress to some extent.
Yeah. No, that's
Like a
brilliant. Wow.
personal trainer, we want to pay a personal trainer, just like you want to pay your psychoanalyst. You pay your personal trainer, and then it's like, okay, I can hate this guy because he's forcing me to work down. I would never do it of my own, you know. But what's really clever is that capitalists really know this.
Mm.
They will install prohibitions into their products, knowing that we need these. So like many years ago, there was a phone called Light Phone. And Light Phone, it was called your phone away from phone. What it did was it you would pay about $800 for it, same price as an iPhone. All you
Sure.
could do is text and make calls.
Mm.
You're buying it because of what it doesn't allow you to do.
Mm.
It prohibits for you. And there's a whole circuit of products that does this. I mean, not just the Coca-Cola, now miniature size, same
Oh
price.
yeah.
We prohibit the intake of the extra amount that you would have consumed. And not only that, but I go even a step further. This is where Zizek doesn't go far enough. He
Okay.
talks about Coca-Cola, the superegoic injunction to enjoy. It allows you to enjoy yourself. What he misses is that this can be the principle of a social bond. Entire communities, BDSM and so on are clear examples, can be formed around satisfaction and around the commodity form. For a long time, we would buy Coca-Cola, and it would have the name of like a person, soulmate, father. Oh, I love
Right.
the way it says father. You'd buy it, you give it to your father, and now you formed a social bond mediated by the product that needs to continuously be replenished. You have to
Mm.
keep buying it in order to have a father.
I love that. So I know. Okay, so do you have time for maybe one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So see if I can connect these dots. So I lately I've been reading the South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han. I think I mentioned that on Facebook Messenger, and he has a lot of books. But in one book, The Burnout Society, he basically says that we've moved from a disciplinary society to an achievement society. And here's my question to you, connecting it maybe to something Zizek says, as I understand him, but it could be that I'm just getting him wrong. He talks about the superego as now the call to enjoy. Byung-Chul Han says the modal verb in the disciplinary society was should. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. But now the modal verb or the modal injunction in the achievement society is you can. Is there a connection there? And is that as tyrannical as it was in the past?
I would agree with that. I think that's a
Okay.
really, yeah. I came up with something about, I don't know, 10 years ago, close to this.
Okay.
The idea was, if you give me 5 minutes to develop,
100%. Take as much time as you need. Sure.
you're very permissive. Thank you. It's
I'm just really enjoying this, man. Thank you for connecting.
wonderful. We need to find limits. Who can I blame? We need it's the old idea of the paternal function, the father, who
Sure.
we were wowed by. You saw it in Judaism.
Mm,
Judaism is thou shalt not. Basically, it's thou shalt not enjoy something.
right.
Neighbor's wife, but you were prohibited, whatever it was. It was a prohibition. It was clear, it was explicit, and it was universal. It was a universal prohibition. Under no circumstances can this lie be broken, although we have some sense of justice where we can navigate a little bit.
Right.
But in the latest version of capitalism, just to give it some, I don't think it's capitalism, but just to give it some sort of a
Sure.
local character, it's I call them particular affirmations. The idea is not a universal prohibition, thou shalt not under any circumstance enjoy yourself in whatever way. It's sometimes you can,
Mm,
sometimes it's okay, dot, dot, dot. And I've been running with this idea for a long time because what really concerned me was the way in which the law can condescend to jouissance. The law can condescend to our satisfactions in such a way that instead of prohibiting them, it can use our satisfactions to regulate us in a
Yes.
much more cunning form. And so, for example, the example I usually give was, and I think I got it a little bit wrong, but it's still going to be my example, the Citizens Amendment Act in India, which would explicitly affirm citizenship rights for particular religious communities,
Mm,
implicitly denying a very large substantive majority community, Muslims.
got you.
And so this is what happens when you move from a universal prohibition, say under Nazism.
Sure.
Jews are universe in the anti-Semitic legislation. Jews are universally prohibited from dot dot dot. In the latest stage of rule, it's not Jews are universally prohibited from inclusion dot dot dot. It's we include this, that, and that, and implicitly you get the prohibition. Instead of
Mm,
an explicit prohibition, it's an implicit prohibition, which is more cunning, more cruel, and so I think this is where our problem is. It's the same with the father who's gone missing.
mm,
Like I was thinking about these attacks on patriarchy. Back when patriarchy was really bad, I'm not saying it's not bad anymore, but back when it was really bad, there were movements rising up, but not everybody was anti-patriarchy. And today, almost everybody that I'm running into, at least in my
right.
circles, anti-patriarchy at a time when we have least patriarchal, the least in a significant amount of time,
Of course.
patriarchal measures, but the father's severity and tyranny is felt even more. It's
Mm,
because it's moved into an implicit register, what I call patriarchy 2.0. It's moved from being, you can point at the guy who's hurting you, to like, all these abstract men are hurting us.
yes.
It's quite the shift. And
Yeah.
again, I'm not saying patriarchy doesn't exist. I'm saying it does exist. It exists much worse than it ever existed before, precisely because it's moved into the real.
I
And
think
this
that's
is where the
brilliant.
real.
I love it. That's so good. Man, I'm so glad you reflected on that. That's that's maybe a great place to end. I guess before we do that, is there anything else about you or your work that you would want to share before we come to a close?
No, I'd like to share less of my work if possible. I'm trying.
Well, Duane, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast, and I hope that we stay connected.
Yeah, thanks, man. Wonderful to be here. Wonderful to finally have a chat, and I'm sure we will stay connected.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.